Can you, yeah, you can hear me all right. I can hear the amp working. Good afternoon. Thanks very much for coming and joining me today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what can you patent anyway, which is a bit of a broad title, but we will narrow that down quite a lot. And if you've seen any of the press releases, I'm going to concentrate a little bit on some of the Industry 4.0 or 4.5 connected manufacturing, which hopefully is relevant to some of you in here. So my name's Andrew Mackenzie. I'm a partner at Cleveland Scott York. I'm an electronics engineer and a UK and European patent attorney. Cleveland Scott York, I'm going to talk about the first of those, patents, today mostly, but also we get involved with protecting brands and advice around intellectual property, how you can use that to maximise value in your company and improve profits. And we work with sort of SMEs upwards, really. We do some stuff for much smaller businesses when they're startups, but often IP is not appropriate for a very early stage business unless the revenue is going to come on stream fairly quickly. So some of the other things we will do for people, I don't know whether this will point, might do, oh there we go. So we get involved in fights with other businesses. That rarely gets to court. You'll probably be pleased to know that's not usually the right answer. If you're looking at acquiring businesses or being acquired, we'll also look at the IP side of businesses and report on quality, whether the stuff is in good shape, that kind of thing. Entitlement disputes, if there's a question over ownership of IP, which often comes up, particularly where you've got multiple employments, you've got subcontractors, those sorts of things, that needs sorting out. We look at that. On the branding side particularly, we look at anti-counterfeiting, which is often not around technology, but actually, you know, your Rolex watches and your Chanel handbags and that sort of thing. I don't do that, I'm purely technology lawyer, but some of my colleagues do. Licensing disputes. And one of the other things that IP is increasingly able to be used for is as security for raising funding for businesses. And like property leases, you can record that sort of security interest, just like a mortgage, against intellectual property. And again, selling rights, it's property, you can transfer it, you need to do that in the right way with the right sort of agreement, just like you would a property lease or a freehold. And just very quickly, final bit about us and then we'll get on with the real stuff. This is the sort of split of work we're doing, predominantly the UK on finances, and actually if you measure that in terms of the work we're doing, predominantly non-UK. So, I'm going to have a very quick canter through the different types of intellectual property. And can I just have a show of hands? Who's got involved with patents before or knows roughly what they are so that I can pitch it about right? Okay, a few of you. That's great. Okay, maybe half. Excellent. Okay. And then we're going to come on to this thing. I don't particularly like that buzzword, but it is, looking around the show today, there's a lot of movement towards trying to make manufacturing more efficient, connecting machines together, standardised communications, and I'll have a look at some of the things that might be patentable there. Quite a few surprises. The patent system's quite friendly to that sort of stuff, so hopefully I can give you a flavour of what's available. And of course, this is all about you. So typically, intellectual property breaks down into registered rights, so that's things where there's an official legal register. Patents, trademarks, and registered designs are the classical three. They have a process for authorization before the patent office. You have to prove you've got the right stuff, and then you get an official certificate. So you do the work at the front end, and then you've got a certificate, you can transfer that, you can register it. Perhaps more importantly, you can very quickly warn competitors that you've got this right, and it's already been tested, so it has quite a lot of weight already. And there's a few others. Don't think plant varieties will necessarily be of much interest in this room today, but semiconductor topology, there's a lot of PCB manufacture and not so much semiconductor that I've seen today, but that sort of thing where you've got a particular electronic layout. There's a special type of right for protecting those and stopping people doing a direct copy of that. And then we come on to the soft IP. where you gain things for free, but if you want to prove them, it's quite expensive to enforce. All businesses have this stuff. These things are mostly not going to be in technology, but the copyright around books has been developed over the years to cover computer programs. There's a lot of stuff in the sort of media about the technical media about copyright in software. Yes, it's available. It's really, really narrow. Don't rely on it unless it's your last resort. Unregistered design rights. A lot of the stuff out there, it has new shapes. So parts that fit together to some extent are excluded. But if you've got mechanical components, you automatically have a very short term, somewhere between 10 and 15 years in the UK, 2 to 3 years over the whole of the EU, short-term free right to protect someone who makes a sort of identikit copy. There are exclusions about allowing people to make spare parts and that sort of thing as a matter of public policy. But generally speaking, if you're making 3D stuff, the moment you make a design document, so a CAD drawing or something, you create one of these. So worth knowing, if you've got somebody that copies something really quickly after you come to market, there's probably something you can do. Even if you've not come and talked to someone like me at all before, it's worth finding an IP specialist, a patent or trademark attorney, and there might be something you can do. These sorts of things typically are mixed up with your workforce, with the people who are doing the R&D. So I'm doing some due diligence on a business at the moment. It's a very specialist business, very successful. It's got 2 people who founded it over the years. They're ready to retire. They're selling to a US multinational. And I looked at the internal report only yesterday. They concluded quite rightly, the buyer, that all of the really valuable stuff is with the 2 owners, and it's all in the know-how. There's a MathCAD model for making this stuff, and only one of the guys knows really how to run it. Big risk for the business, but actually that business has operated largely with this sort of soft IP. It's the only people delivering the product to market that they make, and it's because over the years they've developed the skills to make it. They do have some patents which are, we didn't file them, probably not directed to the right stuff. But the know-how is the key to the business, so always worth bearing in mind. The same again with trade secrets, and this, the classic of course, is the Coca-Cola recipe. These things are really hard to protect. You need to go and talk to your local Formula One team to get some idea how hard it is to keep stuff secret. You will have to make sure that you've got all sorts of access controls on your computers. You've got really, really vicious employment contracts and all this sort of thing, because otherwise this stuff leaks out. So don't assume that you can protect stuff just with this. It's really hard to do. So we get to patents, the topic of the talk today. I think there are about half a dozen of you who have been involved before. They are fairly straightforward. They're typically, the structure of it is like a technical report, and then some legal clauses at the end called claims, which define a boundary around your invention. That boundary has to be for something technical, it has to be for something that's not been publicly disclosed before, and something a bit cleverer than what's on the market or publicly disclosed. European law calls that inventive step. The US law calls that non-obvious. So it's got to be a bit more than new. If you meet all of those things, you will probably get a patent. It gives you 20 years of stopping other people doing what's inside that boundary. It's not a positive right to do stuff. You might still find you infringe other people's rights, even though you've got your own patent. But it is really quite a powerful right. So what can you do with it? Well, I touched on it a few moments ago. If you think of it, I mean, the law of patents really came out of the law of real property, houses and stuff. So it's got a lot of similarities. So you can sell it. You can license it, so somebody pays you some rent to use it, give them permission to do stuff they couldn't otherwise do in return for some benefit to you. The interesting bits are how you enforce it. You don't, not necessarily, this is what most people think of with patents. They think, oh, we're going to sue everyone, and then of course you suddenly think, actually that's expensive and time consuming, and it's rare. There's about 18 cases in the UK each year. That was 18. So very few, and those are nearly all pharmaceutical cases where the money is so huge that it's worth doing it. Very, very few people in this sort of technology sector ever go to court. It's resolved much earlier than that because commercially it makes no sense. the only stuff that I get involved with where there's a real fight is usually because the managing directors had a big falling out 10 years ago and hate each other. Seriously, it's personalities. It never makes commercial sense. Actually, this is a much more interesting one. It can make your businesses much harder to compete with. If you've got a handful of patents that your competitors are infringing, it's really dumb of them to come and give you a bit of a kick, because you can hurt them as well. So actually, the reason this stuff doesn't often go to court is that most people sit down and reach some sensible commercial settlement. We're all in business to make money. We're not trying to destroy each other's businesses. We just want a bigger share or a better profit or something. So there's usually a deal to be done, and patents are really, really effective at getting people to talk and getting them to the table. And that, in my experience, is actually the biggest use, although it's not the one that makes headlines. It's the big patent suit between Apple and Samsung or something that makes the headlines. It doesn't happen very often. You can imagine the numbers involved with smartphones, and if you can delay a smartphone coming to the country for 6 months, you can destroy that brand for that time. It's worth doing, but it's not worth it for most people's businesses in the real world. So what might you actually be able to do commercially with this stuff? Well, if you can demonstrate a good margin, it might be a metric of innovation, people are more likely to invest in you. I see it all the time. I was chatting to some equity investors earlier today. They are touring around. I expect you've seen them. There's various sort of funding people around today. It's rare in my experience that they'll invest in a technology business without really good IP. It's just not worth it, because they make the business successful and then a competitor comes in and copy it, and they don't get their exit and they don't get their return. So it helps you attract investment. You might want a piece of technology that somebody else has. Quite often that's achieved with a cross-license. So no money changes hands, but you say, how about we swap? I got something you need, you've got something I need. So it can be quite a nice way of expanding your business without big R&D investment. And of course the classical thing, market exclusivity. You can keep other people off the turf. You might decide we want the UK or all of the EU for us, but we're prepared to appoint a distributor for the US. Well, clearly you need to control that US distributor, and underpinning all of those successful agreements is intellectual property, making sure that you've got control over what they can and can't do. And then hopefully you get a return on your investment. Now, the European Patent Office has a reports unit. They like producing a report, and they produced a report on the fourth industrial revolution just before Christmas. And this graph is quite simply growth in patent filings up to 2016, which is the last complete data they looked at, starting in 1991. 54% growth in the last 3 years. A lot of people are working on this stuff. Pleasingly, Europe is the biggest patent filer, which suggests that we're doing the most innovative work. So we're leading the world on this stuff. Next is the USA, not surprisingly. And then this I kind of find interesting. I mean, it does underline, obviously the Chinese economy is declared from the top down with a 5-year plan to be moving up the value chain. This sort of underlines it hasn't quite got there yet. It's still largely a copying economy in this field of sort of cyber and man, or whatever you want to call it. And there we are, UK, France and Germany. I was being rather patriotic, actually we're third out of those, but I put us first anyway. But we're top 3 in Europe, in the biggest economy in the world for this technology. So let's keep it up. Now this is what the report covered, and I'm going to drill down into these a little bit in a few minutes. So they were looking at, not surprisingly, this is technology, hardware, software, and how you plug them together. Then they had a look at patents filed in some of the enabling technologies. So quite a lot of stuff you would expect to see there. This is largely software, so this is analytics. Most of these are combined hardware and software. They're sort of fairly traditional patent topics. But I've looked at some of these, and you might be surprised at some of the things that have had successful patent grant. As those of you who have looked at patents in this field before, you will know that there are actually some exclusions to patents which you might expect will be a problem. You're not allowed to patent computer programs. I'll come on to that in a minute. You're not allowed to patent business methods or presentation of information. Which, when you look at this list, you might begin to, or mental acts. And looking at this list here, particularly here, you might think something like AI, that's just a mental act computerized, isn't it? You might think that's not patentable. User interfaces, they're all about presenting information. There are some difficulties in this area, but actually the patent system evolves quite nicely and is generally quite sensible around developing technology. A quick woo for us. The south of England, there we are, big hotspot for this stuff. Lots of businesses in this area are filing patents in this field. The one I particularly like the look of, which is perhaps roughly the same intensity as Côte d'Azur, but if I can find a way to actually move there, then I'll let you know. So who's doing this stuff? Well, usual suspects, you would expect. Yes, it's kind of smartphone-y type stuff, it's tech businesses, but also some of these guys, which perhaps not so obvious. So Boeing is somewhere around here, I don't think you can see, but they're actually pretty big filers, and this isn't all about automated landings and stuff. This is some of the stuff for passenger information, predictive ticketing, all sorts of interesting stuff that you might not classically expect to fall in the patent realm. So if I just take additive manufacturing as an example, we've got at least one 3D printing company out there today. Huge growth in this area. Now, we're all quite familiar with this now. Sintered metal parts, plastic parts, they've been around for a while. It's a classic way to prototype 3D stuff these days, and indeed low volume manufacturing. Some of my colleagues on the sort of biological side of the practice, my background being electronics, this stuff is going on. 3D printed drugs, very exciting stuff. It's all early stage, but it is going to happen. This sort of thing, it's quite tolerant, don't tend to get rejected by the body. It's all very clever stuff. Heart valves are most of what's been done successfully so far, but it will all come, so a nice customised heart valve. Then we've got 4D printing, which was a new one on me, I must admit, and have I got blank faces in the room? Anyone know what 4D printing is? No, okay, good, it wasn't just me then. That's typically something where you have a mix of materials and you might have something which folds in a particular way, so it's sort of intelligent component, so it might drape in a particular way, you vary the elasticity, material properties. Almost impossible to make any other way than with 3D printing where you're building up the layers. So really quite an interesting new area enabled by 3D printing. And then I'm going to come on to the last one. This guy had a bit of a headache, I'm guessing. So this is about modelling. So this particular patent, granted US patent, you do a tissue scan, you look at the skull. This typically is where you've either had a damaged skull or maybe you've got some cancer or something that needs cutting out and you need to model what to put back in. So fairly straightforward stuff, except that what interested me is that the patent only gets as far as all of the modelling stuff. So it's a patent for producing an image like that, which in patent terms is quite odd. You would think that would be just as far as presentation of information. So it's just the mathematical algorithm around the image processing. So certainly as a patent attorney, having done this for quite a few decades, that's quite an unusual patent to get through the system. So the system is quite friendly to this kind of stuff. And I don't know whether any of you watched the sort of surgery program that's been on TV over the last month or two. They are really using this stuff. There's a lady who had quite a bad face cancer sort of here, lost an eye and an eye socket and all this kind of thing. It's worth watching if you don't mind a lot of blood. But they took a chunk of her hip and put it back in her face. But they modelled all of that just like this on computer first. They worked out what they were going to have to cut out. They had a scan of her hip, worked out just what shape they wanted to put it in the face, checked that it all kind of worked with the surgeon looking over the shoulder, and then they 3D printed a mask that the surgeon used to cut the chunk out, which was his guide for using his cutting tools. It all worked beautifully. So this stuff is real world stuff. And then here we've got a hearing aid which is measuring ear canal, measuring internal components, and producing the components for that using 3D printing. So really interesting stuff going on there. This thing, again, from a patent point of view, really surprising. This is a patent granted to Apple.